Mars in the fifth house. Desire in full colour. Welcome to Mars in the fifth house in Synastry. In this overlay, we explore what happens when one person's Mars falls into another person's fifth house. The house of pleasure, creative expression, romantic pursuit, play, sexuality, and the radiant self-expression that emerges when a person is most fully and joyfully alive. This is one of the more naturally hospitable placements for Mars in Synastry, and one of the few in which the planet's activating, desire-driven energy finds a house that is genuinely equipped to receive it. The fifth house is not a house that asks for restraint or subtlety. It is a house of appetite, of wanting, of creating, of pursuing pleasure with the full weight of one's personality behind it. Mars, whose nature is fundamentally appetitive, finds in the fifth house a domain that does not flinch from what it brings. The result is an overlay of considerable vitality, genuine passion, and creative heat, one that is capable of producing some of the most exhilarating relational experiences in Synastry, and that carries, in its shadow, the specific risks of a fire that burns without sufficient care for what surrounds it. The fifth house governs the self in its most expressive and pleasure-oriented mode. It is the house of romance in its early, luminous phase, the pursuit, the courtship, the intoxicating quality of desire before it has been tested by time or circumstance. It is also the house of creative output, the works a person makes not out of professional obligation, but out of the sheer need to bring something from the interior life into visible form. Play belongs here, and so does performance. The pleasure of being seen in one's full self-expression, of occupying the stage of one's own life with genuine joy and without apology. In traditional astrology, the fifth house is associated with children, with games, with feasting and celebration. All the expressions of life lived in its more generous and enjoyment-oriented register. It is a succedent house, which gives it a quality of building and sustaining pleasure rather than simply initiating it. What the fifth house cultivates, it cultivates with real investment. There is also a traditional association worth noting here. The sun has its joy in the fifth house, the planet of vitality, creative identity, and radiant self-expression finds its most natural home in the house of pleasure and creation. Mars and the sun are not identical in nature, but they share something. Both are planets of heat, of forward motion, of the desire to act and to be seen acting. Mars in the house of the sun's joy is Mars in a domain that has a genuine sympathy with its fire. This does not eliminate the complications that Mars's malefic nature introduces anywhere it goes, but it does mean that the energy Mars brings here has a genuine resonance with the house's own character, something that cannot be said of every placement in this series. From the Mars person's perspective, the house person is immediately and compellingly desirable, not only physically, though the physical dimension is almost always present and often pronounced, but in a fuller sense that includes the house person's creative life, their manner of self-expression, their quality of play, and pleasure-seeking. The Mars person is drawn to the house person's radiance, to the particular way they inhabit their own joy, the way they take up creative space, the way they pursue what they want. There is an appetite here that is genuine and multidimensional. The Mars person wants to be close to the house person's creative fire, to be part of their pleasure, to pursue them with the full force of Martian desire, and to find that pursuit welcomed rather than deflected. The Mars person in this overlay is often experienced by the house person as a genuinely exciting presence, someone who pursues them with flattering directness, who brings energy and desire into the house person's pleasure-oriented world with an enthusiasm that feels genuinely thrilling. The Mars person makes the house person feel wanted in a way that activates rather than burdens, that adds heat to the house person's own sense of themselves as someone worth pursuing. There is a quality of being genuinely sought here that the house person may find among the most vitalizing experiences in the relationship. The Mars person may also find themselves drawn into a more active and engaged relationship with their own desire and creativity through the house person's presence. The fifth house reflects back to Mars a version of its own energy that is less combative and more celebratory, less about conflict and dominance, more about the sheer pleasure of wanting and being wanted, creating and being seen creating. This can be genuinely expanding for the Mars person, who does not always encounter a domain that receives their energy with this quality of natural welcome. From the house person's perspective, the Mars person's energy arrives in the domain of creative expression, romantic joy, and personal pleasure, and the arrival is rarely quiet. The house person is likely to feel the Mars person's presence as a genuine ignition of this dimension of their life. Creative projects that had stalled may find new momentum in the Mars person's enthusiastic engagement. Romantic feelings that had become comfortable or habitual may be rekindled into something more urgent and alive. The house person may find themselves more willing to take creative risks, to express themselves more boldly, to pursue their own pleasures with greater confidence and less self-censorship, simply because the Mars person's energy in this house makes appetite feel not only acceptable, but celebrated. The physical and sexual dimension of this overlay is significant and worth addressing directly. Mars in the fifth house produces strong sexual chemistry, not the psychologically complex, power-laden sexuality of the eighth house, but something more immediate and less burdened, desire in its most direct and joyful expression. There is a quality of genuine erotic pleasure here that is uncomplicated by the need for transformation or control. Both people simply want each other, and that wanting is mutual, reciprocal, and expressed with a freedom and enthusiasm that both find genuinely satisfying. The fifth house is the house of pleasure, and Mars here ensures that the physical pleasure between these two people has real heat behind it, not merely warmth, but fire. At its most constructive, this overlay creates a relationship of remarkable vitality across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The romantic dimension is alive and genuinely pursued. The creative dimension is stimulated and productive. The Mars person's energy may catalyze the house person's most significant creative work, pushing them toward bolder expression and greater creative ambition than they would sustain without that charge. The playful dimension is real. There is genuine fun here, genuine delight in each other's company, a quality of enjoying life together that does not require the relationship to be weighted with significance in order to feel worthwhile. This overlay also produces a relationship that is genuinely honest about desire, that does not require either person to disguise or minimize what they want from the other. Mars in the fifth says what it wants clearly and pursues it with open appetite. The fifth house receives that honesty with its own characteristic directness. The result is a dynamic in which both people know where they stand, what is wanted, and what is being freely offered, a clarity about desire that many relationships, tangled in politeness or ambiguity, never achieve. The shadow dimension of this overlay is real, though it operates differently from the more immediately serious shadows of the fourth or the second. Mars in the fifth is not naturally a placement of sustained domestic menace or economic control. Its difficulties are more specific to the nature of the fifth house itself, to desire, to pleasure, to the ego investments that creative self-expression always involves. The first and most consistent shadow here is the tendency of Mars to introduce a competitive dimension into domains that function better without it. The fifth house is the house of creative expression and romantic pursuit, both of which require a degree of ego investment and self-exposure that makes them inherently vulnerable to comparison and contest. Mars, whose instinct is always to establish dominance, can introduce into the house person's creative life a quality of competition that undermines rather than stimulates. The Mars person may, consciously or not, respond to the house person's creative work or romantic self-expression with a comparative energy that the house person experiences as diminishing rather than encouraging. The house person may begin to feel that their creative expression is being assessed rather than celebrated, that the pleasure of making and sharing has acquired an uncomfortable edge of performance anxiety introduced by the Mars person's implicit or explicit standards. The sexual dimension of this overlay also carries a shadow that must be named. Mars in the fifth can produce a dynamic in which the Mars person's desire, initially experienced by the house person as thrilling and affirming, begins over time to feel more like pressure than pursuit. Mars's appetite does not naturally moderate itself in response to the other person's fluctuating availability or enthusiasm. The fifth house governs pleasure, and pleasure requires genuine willingness on both sides to remain pleasurable. When the Mars person's desire becomes a persistent pressure that does not adequately attend to the house person's own rhythms of wanting and not wanting, what began as erotic vitality can shade into something considerably less welcome, a dynamic in which the house person's pleasure is secondary to the satisfaction of the Mars person's appetite. At the more serious end of this spectrum, Mars's malefic nature in the fifth house can express itself as a controlling or possessive relationship to the house person's creative life, romantic expression, or sexuality. A need to dominate the very domain that the house person experiences as most essentially their own. The fifth house is where a person is most themselves in their joy, and a Mars that attempts to own or direct that joy rather than celebrate it is a Mars that has moved from being a source of pleasure into being a source of constraint. The distinction between passionate pursuit and possessive control is one that Mars, if it is not consciously attending to the other person's experience, can cross without ever quite noticing that it has done so. At its highest expression, Mars in the fifth house creates a relationship of genuine creative and romantic aliveness, one in which both people feel more joyful, more desirous, more creatively bold, and more fully expressed for having encountered each other. The Mars person brings heat and enthusiasm into the house person's most vibrant and pleasure-oriented domain, pursuing them with a directness and energy that makes the house person feel genuinely and specifically wanted. The house person gives the Mars person's desire a worthy and joyful object, a creative fire and quality of self-expression that makes the pursuit feel meaningful rather than merely appetitive. When balanced, Mars in the fifth house creates passionate romance, creative vitality, genuine erotic pleasure, and a relationship in which both people feel more alive in their self-expression and more joyfully themselves for the encounter. When imbalanced, it can produce creative competition, sexual pressure, possessiveness over the house person's joy and self-expression, and, at its most reductive, a dynamic in which the house person's pleasure becomes something the Mars person seeks to own rather than something they are genuinely invited to share. What this overlay ultimately turns on is whether the Mars person understands that the fifth house does not belong to them, that the house person's joy, creativity, and desire are not resources to be consumed or directed, but fires to be approached with the reverence that all genuine light deserves. Mars that enters the fifth house with that understanding finds itself in one of the most naturally welcoming placements in synastry. Mars that enters without it finds eventually that what it has extinguished is the very thing that made the connection worth wanting in the first place.
This was Mars in the fifth house in synastry overlays. Thank you for listening. Next, Mars in the sixth house.